Noirlandia is a very unique 96-page murder mystery RPG written by Evan Rowland and published in 2016 after a Kickstarter campaign. The game runs 96 pages, but in fact a lot of it is example text and other filler. What you're actually getting is a far shorter game in terms of rules description, but this is a very special game in terms of how it approaches the murder mystery and how to solve it. The idea is this. With every new game, which is intended to be a one-shot, your table creates a new city with its own distinct identity and features, but everyone makes this city together on the spot since there is no GM. Part of the game's enjoyment is the setup. After creating the city, everyone creates their character and describes the victim, but not why the victim was killed. Then each player takes turns being the highlight of an investigatory scene where they try to solve the murder. It's very story gamey up until the investigation scenes, then a surprising amount of dice rolling and harder game mechanics take hold. Since there are dice involved, you don't really know if your group will solve the murder or not. Setting up the city together is a guided process. Step 1 is establishing the source of the corruption in your city. Since the genre of this game is film noir, the setting by default is a city and it's corrupt. One thing to note here is that the game doesn't tell you where your city is or in what era. As long as you stick to the dour, cynical feel of noir in your game, you're playing it as intended. Step 2 is defining the city itself. This is a GM-less game, so you go around the table taking turns answering these 4 questions. Anyone who answers a particular question takes ownership of that aspect of the city. They write it down on an index card and keep track of it for the rest of the game. Step 3 is describing the physical structures that define the 4 districts of your city. The 4 districts are downtown, Skid Row, outskirts, and upper crust, but you can rename them as you see fit. Each are represented by a card's suit. And here's where we get to the most charming gimmick of this entire game. You are asked to put each of these 4 districts in the 4 corners of a corkboard. You can use a virtual tabletop, of course, but who hasn't ever wanted to fill a corkboard with snippets from a murder investigation and then tie little strings from pin to pin wherever there's a connection? This game really embraces the corkboard for tracking collective progress, and it's great. Anyway, when something happens in a particular district and you need to pin it up, you will pin it in that district's quadrant of the board. Step 4 is fleshing out your city a little bit more. Not by taking turns here, but just by talking it out at the table. Is the city gritty and realistic, or is it strange and alien? Do people use normal everyday language, or do they have unique slang words? The next major phase in the game is creating characters, which actually happens pretty fast. You lay down a number of playing cards on the table equal to the number of players plus 1, then roll a d6 for each card and place that die on top. Each card and die set represents a character, and you can see from these tables how fast a character is generated. Players will then choose the character they want to assume and write down their characteristics on their character sheet. The final leftover card that was drawn and rolled on is the victim. I thought this was kind of interesting because the victim is always going to be the least desirable character in terms of what people want to play as. It's almost like the victim was a character who was sentenced to death for not pleasing or inspiring the players. Anyway, you name this victim, assign a picture to them, and pin that in the middle of your board, then draw a big X on them. Step 3 of the character phase is to sort out character stats. Name, appearance, and most importantly, your rating for body, mind, heart, and rep. Each of these 4 stats can be rated across 5 levels, and you're allowed to allocate the 4 at certain levels at the start, which will go up and down in the course of play. You also need to describe your character's connection to the victim, one that is strong enough to drive your character to investigate their murder. Remember, most characters are not officially detectives in this game. They're just citizens or denizens of the city, but they're still here to solve the murder. Finally, you draw 2 cards to create a couple of initial leads. The first card is a location and the second is a suspicious object. These cards correspond to tables at the end of the book. The leads are pinned to the districts that they correspond to. The game actually has a victory condition, and it comes in 3 parts. Your characters need to be able to find the answers to these 3 questions, at which point the murder is solved and the epilogue is triggered. To get answers, you play out scenes where characters each take turns putting their character in the spotlight as the others play as NPCs and co-GM the details. Each of these scenes involves some free-form roleplay, then a challenge roll when the spotlight character does something difficult or dangerous, then a little more free-form roleplay, and finally an investigation role that resolves how the investigation advances. Investigation roles create new leads and connections, and you need to have 3 connected leads to answer one of the 3 in-game questions. Challenge roles start with picking one of the 4 core stats or conditions that best fit the challenge. Then the protagonist rolls a white die, and any supporter player rolls 1 or more black dice, taking the highest one. The result determines if the protagonist gets to narrate success or failure. It also determines who gets to keep their dice for the final investigation roll of that scene. I won't get into the weeds here on how an investigation roll works, but it's basically a competing dice pool where the protagonist rolls against the supporters. The pairings can be manipulated by using bargains, which can cause narrative setbacks for the protagonist. The final pairings are translated by the tables here, which drive forward the investigation in one way or another. Once the investigation roll is resolved and narrated, it's on to the next scene where another player character is the protagonist. There's one important thing to note here. Districts can be escalated in the course of the investigation, meaning something chaotic or ground shaking happens to the city generally. If the city is escalated 3 times before the players are able to answer the 3 big questions, then the game actually ends without them solving the mystery, and the players have to narrate the epilogue accordingly. There are some more rules here on how leads can and can't be connected. And finally, 1 page of guidance on how to interpret everyone's character sheets and their final condition to formulate how an epilogue is narrated. I thought this was a very clever and thoughtful marrying of the 2 gameplay types of storytelling and hard dice mechanics into one final finish. Alright, here are my thoughts on Noirlandia. Involved dice mechanics. The dice resolution system is not rocket science, but it's not intuitive at first glance either. I'm not sure if the author lifted it from some game or if he came up with it on his own, but it's pretty unique to me, and it took some getting used to. At first read, it was a bit jarring next to the story-gamey consensus style of world building that the rest of the game is composed of. Dice resolution. As much as the resolution mechanic is hard to run smoothly at first, it's first and foremost what I think makes the game complete. You could definitely have made a murder mystery game where it's mostly just collaborative description around the table, but by inserting a relatively deep dice mechanic that's infused with character stats, player choices, and random tables, you're getting a game that does, at least for a portion of the time, help guide the story a bit and lend structure to the whole experience. Build it together. The rest of the game, where you come up with the city characters and to some degree the epilogue as a group with a few simple prompts, is an aspect that only works when players are of a certain mind. Everyone needs to be feeling creative and confident when coming to the table, but if they're in that mindset, ready to function as a co-GM, the act of collaboratively building a story is where you'll see emergent gameplay flourish. Any setting. The genre of this game is supposed to be film noir, which can loosely be described as characters having cynical attitudes and motivations against a backdrop of corruption and injustice. But that theme is not limited to the big city in the 20th or 21st century. The murder mystery could be set in Waterdeep or a space colony or 17th century Istanbul. That detail is established in the first steps of the game, and it's where some of the most fun can be had, not to mention the characters that would emerge from an offbeat setting. This is just a very self-contained murder mystery RPG that gives you as much creative freedom as it does solid dice mechanics. You can set the adventure anywhere you want, but you still have a character sheet with stats, and it should all wrap up one way or another within a single game session. Oh, and if you're playing in person with an actual corkboard, you get to look like Charlie at the end of it. Well, that's all for now. If you want to keep this channel going, please consider joining my Patreon. Link in the description. Thanks. See ya.